Jane stumbled through the hotel corridor, disoriented and weak. She had been drugged by Michael, her fiancé, and Lola, her sister, the two people she trusted most. Their plan was simple: destroy her reputation by setting her up with a male prostitute. But as she fought to stay conscious, she ended up in the wrong room, and then this happened. Hey there. If this is your first time here, welcome. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. Share it with your friends and family so they don't miss out. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. It all started in a cramped apartment in Lagos, where Jane and Michael sat on the floor, surrounded by old laptops and stacks of papers, trying to make sense of a dream they both couldn't shake. Michael had the vision he always did. But Jane, she had the brain. She was the one who stayed up late, helping him code the website, draft the business plans, and negotiate deals with anyone who was willing to listen. She knew that the company they were building was something special. She'd given up so much for this. The scholarship to study abroad, the dream of traveling the world, all of it for Michael. She believed in him. And in them. They were partners, best friends, really. In a city like Lagos, where most businesses failed before they even started, Jane and Michael were making it work. There was the day the first investor signed on, then the first big deal that almost collapsed under pressure, and the long nights of stress and exhaustion that Jane had lived through, convinced they were building something that would change everything. The company grew faster than anyone could have imagined. From that tiny room in Lagos to a startup that was about to be listed on the stock market. Michael's dream, Jane's sacrifice, it was all happening. But with success came changes, and the man she once knew started slipping away. The Michael she knew used to tell her everything. But now there were moments when he seemed distant. His mind always elsewhere. They had started their business with a promise that they would always be in this together, that success would be their shared victory. But something was different. Michael had been saying for months, "We'll get married once the company goes public. Just wait a little longer, Jane. We're so close now." But that little longer kept getting extended, and Jane started to wonder if maybe their success meant more to him than their future together. The day the company was listed on the stock market should have felt like a victory lap. It was the moment they had worked for, the moment Jane had dreamed about for years. But as Jane sat in the crowd, watching Michael stand at the podium, something felt off. The applause, the excitement in the air was all there, but Jane's heart wasn't in it. Michael was smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't the warmth she had grown used to, the affection that had always been there, even in the toughest times. The man she knew had been passionate about their dreams, about the future they were building together. But Michael, the one speaking at the podium, seemed like a stranger. He caught her eye for a brief second, a fleeting moment that lasted just long enough for Jane to wonder if he even saw her anymore. "We did it," Michael said, his voice booming over the crowd. "This is just the beginning. And I couldn't have done it without all of you, especially Jane." The last words were meant for her, but they didn't feel real. Jane clapped along with the others, but the smile on her face was forced. Her mind kept circling back to the same thing. Why did Michael look at her like he was seeing her for the first time? The event wrapped up with the usual cheers and congratulations, but instead of celebrating, Jane felt a heavy weight in her chest. The night should have been theirs. This was their moment, their triumph. But as they walked out of the venue, Michael's hand didn't feel as warm in hers. She squeezed it, but he didn't squeeze back. Once they were back at the apartment, Jane tried to push away the feeling of unease. "Michael," she said, her voice soft but hopeful, "I know things have been crazy with the company, but we've finally made it. Do you think we could start planning the wedding now?" Michael paused. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. His eyes drifted toward the window, like he was thinking about something far away. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant. "Jane, we'll get to it. There's still so much to do. We've come this far, but now we need to make sure the company stays strong. The future's looking bright, but we need to stay focused." Jane nodded, trying to push back the frustration rising in her chest. It was always the same. The company, the deals, the meetings, it always came first. You said after the IPO, she reminded, her voice quiet, that we'd get married once the company went public. That was the plan. Michael turned to her, his expression softening just a little. I know. But we're not there yet, Jane. We need to keep pushing. We'll have everything we've dreamed of, just a little longer. You know, this company means everything to me. It was the same story. Always just a little longer. Jane couldn't help but feel like she was waiting on something that would never come. She had sacrificed everything for him, for them, and all she had was this vague promise that hung in the air, slipping further out of reach. I believe in you, she said, her heart aching as she looked at him, still hoping. I've always believed in you. Michael smiled, but this time it didn't feel like the smile she had fallen in love with. It was more like a polite gesture, a reassurance he didn't believe himself. I know you do. And I promise once we get everything in place, it'll happen. You'll see. But Jane couldn't shake the feeling that the more they succeeded, the further she was from the life she had imagined. The promises he made, once so sure and filled with hope, were starting to feel empty. The days stretched into weeks, then months. Michael remained distant, caught up in the whirlwind of the company's success. Every time Jane asked about the wedding, he'd brush it off. We'll get to it. Just a little longer. Jane kept waiting. She had no reason to believe he wouldn't keep his word. After all, he had promised her everything. But deep down, she began to wonder if those promises meant anything at all. Lola always looked up to Jane. She admired her strength, her determination, the way she never gave up. But somewhere along the way, a quiet jealousy began to brew inside her. Jane had it all. Michael's love, the success of their business, the respect of everyone around them. Lola had always felt like the shadow, forever following in her sister's footsteps, never able to escape her. But she didn't want to just be the shadow anymore. She wanted what Jane had, and she wanted it all. It started when Lola begged Jane to hire her as she was fired from her last place of work. Then Jane hired her as Michael's assistant. Michael and Lola would talk during meetings, just casual conversations about the business. Jane was always so wrapped up in the company that she didn't notice when Michael began to pay more attention to Lola than he ever did before. Lola, for her part, found herself drawn to Michael. He was successful, confident, and powerful, the kind of man she'd always dreamed of being with. And one day, when Jane wasn't around, it happened. The first kiss was accidental, a brush of lips during a moment of tension. But the heat between them couldn't be ignored. Lola felt alive in a way she hadn't before. With Michael, she didn't have to be in Jane's shadow. She was the one being noticed, desired, wanted. And that craving for attention, for something more, quickly grew into something much more dangerous. Soon, it was no longer just about the physical attraction. Lola began to see Michael not only as a lover, but as the key to her future, her way out of her sister's shadow. The affair continued, hidden from Jane, as they met in secret. Michael was different with Lola. He was more relaxed, more free. With Jane, it was always about business, always about the company. But with Lola, he didn't feel the pressure. They spoke about more than just work. They spoke about dreams of their future, of what they could do if they took everything Jane had built. And every time Michael whispered about how much they could achieve together, Lola grew more determined to make that future a reality. The plan began to form quietly, in the dark corners of their secret meetings. Michael would have to break it to Jane eventually, he said. But he knew Jane wouldn't give up her stake in the company without a fight. Lola, on the other hand, saw things differently. Jane's dedication to the company was an obstacle, a roadblock standing in the way of everything Lola wanted. If Jane was out of the picture, Lola could step into her place both in Michael's life and in the company. It was a dangerous game they were playing. But Lola didn't care. She had already invested too much of herself in Michael to back out now. The more she thought about it, the more the idea seemed like a perfect solution. Jane had been so wrapped up in the company that she hadn't noticed the slow unraveling of her relationship. Lola had already started laying the groundwork, planting the seeds of doubt in Michael's mind, convincing him that Jane would never understand. She was too focused on the company to truly see what Michael needed. And so the plan took shape. It wasn't enough to just have Michael. Lola wanted it all. She wanted the company, the power, the control. Jane's success was her burden now, and if she had to get rid of her sister to have it, so be it. Michael, who had once loved Jane with all his heart, was now driven by a different kind of ambition. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about power. Together, he and Lola would make sure Jane had no claim to the company. The money, the shares, the control, everything would be theirs. Lola looked at Michael one evening, her mind made up. "Are you sure about this?" she asked him, her voice low. Michael met her gaze, the weight of his decision heavy in his eyes. "It's the only way. I've been putting it off for too long. We're doing this for us, Lola. For the future, for our baby. Jane's not going to understand, but she'll have to accept it." Lola smiled, a sense of cold satisfaction settling over her. "Then let's make sure she never sees it coming." The night was supposed to be a celebration, a quiet dinner to mark the company's latest success. Jane had been looking forward to it all week, eager to spend some time with Michael and enjoy the victory they had worked so hard for. But from the moment they sat down, something felt off. Michael seemed distant. Lola, sitting beside him, gave Jane a look that made her stomach churn, but Jane dismissed it as paranoia. After all, they were celebrating. This was their moment. Michael had called it a celebration dinner, after the successful closing of a new deal. It should have been the perfect time to talk about their future, their wedding plans. Instead, Michael's attention kept drifting between his phone and Lola, who sat there, silent and composed, watching everything unfold. Jane couldn't help but feel like there was something else going on. As the evening wore on, Jane noticed how tense Michael had become. He was barely looking at her, barely engaging in conversation. When Jane gently suggested they leave, Michael pushed back. "Just one more drink, Jane. You deserve to relax. We've made it." Reluctantly, Jane agreed, thinking a quiet drink would ease the tension. Little did she know this was part of their plan, the plan Michael and Lola had spent months preparing, a plan to tear her down. They brought her to a private room, dimly lit and isolated from the rest of the party. "You've been working so hard, Jane," Michael said, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. "Let's just unwind for a little while." Jane, feeling the weight of the evening and the exhaustion settling in, sipped the drink he handed her. It was sweet, almost too sweet, and she could feel the warmth spread through her body. But then her head began to swim. The edges of her vision blurred, and the room felt like it was spinning. She tried to shake off the dizzy feeling, but it was too late. The drug was already taking hold. Her limbs felt heavy, and the world around her felt like it was slipping away. She turned to Michael, hoping he would notice something was wrong, but he was already standing, moving toward the door. "Stay here, Jane," he said, his words slow, almost rehearsed. "We'll take care of everything. You've earned this." She didn't even have time to respond before he opened the door and motioned for someone to enter. A man standing in the hallway, waiting. "Take her to the next room," Michael ordered, his voice colder than Jane had ever heard it. Jane was barely able to comprehend what was happening. She stumbled to her feet, trying to focus, but the world was spinning too fast. She wasn't sure how or why, but something inside her told her this wasn't right. Something was terribly wrong. As the man moved toward her, Jane panicked. She pushed past him, her movements uncoordinated but desperate. She needed to get out of there. She needed to find something, anything, that would make sense of the fog in her mind. In her disoriented state, Jane stumbled down the hallway, every step shaky, every movement uncertain. She heard the man behind her, but she couldn't focus on him. Her only thought was escape. She didn't know where she was going, but she pushed open a door and rushed inside. It wasn't until she collapsed onto a plush couch that she realized where she was. The suite was grand, unfamiliar, yet comforting in its luxury. Jane's mind tried to piece together the fragments of what had happened, but her vision was still hazy, her body still trembling. Then she heard a voice that wasn't Michael's. Jane. The voice was soft, yet urgent, and Jane's head snapped up. She blinked, trying to focus on the man who stood in the doorway, looking both surprised and concerned. Peter Maxwell, the billionaire businessman who had always kept his distance, was standing before her. He had been at the event earlier, but she didn't remember seeing him leave. Peter moved quickly to her side, his expression filled with worry. "What happened to you?" He reached out, steadying her as she tried to sit up, still disoriented. Jane tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Her mind felt like it was in a fog, everything blurred, disconnected. She opened her mouth to explain, but the effort left her feeling even more exhausted. Peter didn't wait for her to say anything. He immediately called for a doctor, his voice firm yet caring. "You're safe now. Just stay with me." Jane barely understood what was happening. She tried to make sense of the events that had led her here, but it was all too much. Her mind kept racing, trying to piece together the betrayal that had just begun to unfold around her. And just as her vision began to fade again, the drug's effects taking full hold, Jane's body went limp. The last thing she remembered was Peter's voice, urgent and protective, but then everything went black. The room felt too quiet, too still. Jane's senses were still fighting the fog in her mind as she struggled to wake up. Her head pounded like a drum, the weight of exhaustion and the effects of the drug pulling her under. She tried to blink away the confusion, but everything around her was blurry, out of focus. The warmth of the room, the softness beneath her, it felt like she was in some strange, distant place. But then a voice. "Jane." Her name sounded unfamiliar, distant like an echo. She forced her eyes open again, and through the haze she saw him, Peter Maxwell. His face, usually calm and controlled, was now filled with something else. Concern, fear, urgency. His presence seemed to pierce through the fog, anchoring her to reality. "Peter," she whispered, her voice weak and cracked, barely more than a breath. He was kneeling beside her now, his hands steadying her as she tried to sit up. "Take it easy," Peter said softly, his voice a comforting balm against the confusion swirling in her head. "You're safe now." The word didn't quite reach her. She didn't feel safe. She felt lost. "What happened?" Jane's voice trembled, her throat dry. Her mind scrambled to piece together the events that had led her here, but the details were scattered like broken glass. Michael, Lola, room, a drink. Peter seemed to read the panic building in her eyes. "You were drugged, Jane," he said gently, his voice firm but kind. "By Michael and Lola." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Michael and Lola, the people she trusted most. Betrayal, cold and unforgiving, flooded through her. "No," she gasped, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, they wouldn't. Not them." Peter's eyes softened with sympathy. "I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. They've been planning this for months. They drugged you and tried to set you up with a male prostitute, to ruin your reputation, take everything you've built." Jane's breath hitched. Her world tilted, crashing down with the weight of his words. She could feel her body shaking, her mind rebelling against the impossible truth he was laying at her feet. She had been played. And the worst part, she hadn't even seen it coming. Jane struggled to form the words, but they felt heavy, lodged in her throat. The drug still clouded her thoughts, making everything feel unreal. "I don't remember how I ended up here." Peter didn't let her falter. He held her gaze, his eyes steady, unflinching. "You managed to escape. They sent you to that room, but you got away. You stumbled in here, into my room. I called a doctor and he's taken care of you. You're safe now." The word felt foreign to her. She hadn't felt safe in so long. Not with Michael. Not with Lola. And now, not even with herself. Peter stayed by her side as the minutes passed. His presence a silent promise that she wouldn't face this alone. He didn't speak much, just quietly reassuring her every time she stirred, every time she looked like she might collapse back into the dark confusion threatening to swallow her. The doctor returned shortly after, checking her vitals and administering fluids. Jane barely registered the process, still too lost in the maelstrom of emotions crashing inside her. Betrayal, anger, fear, pain. When the doctor finally left, Jane was left alone with her thoughts. Peter had been right there, never once leaving her side. His care was more than just physical. It was something deeper, something that made Jane feel like she wasn't entirely broken. Yet, deep down, she knew the worst was still to come. The truth was just beginning to unfold. "I don't know what to do, Peter," Jane said, her voice barely above a whisper. The tears she had been holding back for hours finally broke free, streaming down her face, raw and unfiltered. "I've lost everything." Peter reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "No, you haven't lost everything, Jane. You've been betrayed, but you're not alone in this. I'll help you fight for what's yours, for everything they tried to take from you." His words were a lifeline, something Jane hadn't realized she needed until now. She had always thought she was strong enough to handle everything on her own, to fix the broken pieces of her life by herself. But in that moment, as the weight of her situation came crashing down, she realized she didn't have to do it alone. Peter's voice softened, filled with something Jane couldn't quite place. "You don't have to face this alone, Jane. I'll be here. And we'll figure out how to make them pay for what they've done to you." For the first time since everything had started to fall apart, Jane allowed herself to believe it, to believe that there was hope. Her heart ached, and her mind was still reeling from the betrayal. But in that moment, with Peter by her side, she felt a flicker of something else: determination. The road ahead would be long. The fight would be ugly. But Jane knew one thing for sure now. She wasn't going to let Michael and Lola destroy everything she had worked for. Not without a fight. The days after the announcement blurred together, each one heavier than the last. Jane's mind was still reeling from the shock, from the devastation of Michael's betrayal. But as she regained some clarity, the weight of the truth began to settle on her chest like a vice, squeezing out any semblance of comfort. The drug had worn off, but her heart still ached, and the puzzle pieces of the past few months slowly began to fall into place, each one sharper than the last. She sat on the edge of the bed in Peter's suite, staring at the walls, as if expecting them to offer some kind of explanation. Her eyes were puffy from sleepless nights, her body still weak from the effects of what had happened. Yet, despite all of it, her mind was finally clear enough to understand the full extent of her situation. Peter had stayed with her through the night, a quiet guardian in the dimly lit room. She hadn't asked him to, but he hadn't left her side. Every time she woke, he was there, his steady presence grounding her, helping her through the darkest moments of the night. But despite his reassurances, Jane knew one thing: the worst wasn't over. As she sat up, the weight of her situation finally hit her fully. She had no idea what had happened between the time she had left Michael and Lola's room and when she had ended up in Peter's suite. Her thoughts scattered, her emotions raw. She tried to shake off the lingering dizziness, but it was hard. The drug still had a hold on her mind, clouding her memories. Peter looked up from his phone, his eyes hardening as he read something. "Michael. He's made an announcement," Peter said, his voice low. "He and Lola, they think they've won, Jane." Jane's chest tightened. "What announcement?" Peter handed her the phone. The words on the screen were like a slap in the face. "Michael Monroe and Jane Harrison end engagement. Relationship officially over." The headline hit her like a sledgehammer. Michael, the man she had loved, the man she had given up everything for, was publicly announcing that their engagement was over. As if their years together had been nothing more than a footnote in his journey. The words on the screen blurred as Jane's vision filled with tears, her hands shaking as she read through the text. The statement was cold, detached, as though everything they had built together was being erased in one breath. Michael claimed that their relationship had run its course, and in the same breath, he declared he was now moving forward with other plans. Jane couldn't breathe. The shock was almost too much to process. How had this happened? The betrayal had been enough, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. He believes the plan worked, Peter said, his voice low. He and Lola think you'll be too humiliated to fight back. They've taken everything from you. The shares, the control of the company. They think they've won. Jane's pulse raced. The realization of how deep the betrayal went crushed her. Michael and Lola had plotted against her, used her trust, and now, in one swift public announcement, they had not only torn apart her relationship but had also set the stage to strip her of everything she had worked for. "Do they really think I won't fight back?" she muttered under her breath, the sting of Michael's betrayal now twisting into rage. Peter placed a steadying hand on her arm, his touch gentle yet firm. "You don't have to do this alone. They want you broken, Jane. But they're wrong. You're stronger than they think." Jane stared at the screen, her heart hammering in her chest. It felt like everything she had worked for, the company, the dreams they'd shared, the life she'd sacrificed so much for, was slipping through her fingers. How could she fight back when she was so broken? When she didn't even know where to begin? But then the fire in her heart began to rise. Well, this wasn't how it ended. This wasn't how she would let it end. She would take back what was hers. "I'm not giving up," she said, her voice steadying, growing more firm with every word. "They think they've won, but they have no idea what's coming. This isn't over, not by a long shot." Peter gave her a small, approving smile. "I'm with you, Jane. Every step of the way." But just as Jane began to find her resolve, Peter's face darkened, his expression turning serious again. There was something else. Something crucial he had yet to say. "There's one more thing you need to know," Peter said quietly, as if he were weighing the words carefully. Jane's eyes searched his face. "What is it?" Peter hesitated, then spoke, his voice thick with the weight of his revelation. "Lola is pregnant, Jane. She's pregnant with Michael's child." The words struck Jane like a physical blow. Her mind went blank, unable to process what Peter had just said. Her sister, her own flesh and blood, was carrying Michael's child. The depth of the betrayal was deeper than she had ever imagined. "Pregnant?" Jane echoed, barely able to breathe, let alone comprehend the enormity of what Peter had just revealed. "Lola, uncle. She's carrying his baby." Peter nodded grimly. "They've been planning this from the start. Michael wanted to cut all ties with you, but Lola's pregnancy was the final piece. It's how they'll solidify their control. They'll make sure they're seen as the new power couple, and you'll be left with nothing." Jane's chest tightened, the pain of betrayal crashing over her once more. How could Lola, her own sister, do this to her? How could Michael, the man she had trusted more than anyone, do this to her? The thought of Lola carrying Michael's child twisted something deep inside her. Her sister had been complicit in the destruction of everything Jane had ever dreamed of. But as the rage built inside her, so did the determination. Jane was not going to let them win. Not now. Not ever. She wiped away her tears, her eyes hardening with a resolve she hadn't felt in days. "They think this is over. They think they've broken me. But they're wrong. I'm going to make them regret this. Every last bit of it." The sting of betrayal still burned in Jane's chest, but now there was something else stirring beneath the hurt, anger. And with that anger, a new sense of purpose. She wasn't going to let Michael and Lola tear down everything she had built. They had underestimated her, believing that they could destroy her by taking away the love of her life and the empire she had worked so hard to create. But Jane wasn't broken. Not yet. She paced around Peter's suite, the weight of her situation heavy on her shoulders, but her mind was racing, already plotting, already planning. The rage inside her was becoming something sharper, more focused. She would fight back. She had to. She wasn't going to let Michael's betrayal and Lola's treachery be the end of her story. Peter was sitting at the desk, going through papers, but he looked up at her, his eyes steady and supportive. "We'll get them, Jane. I'll help you take back what's yours." Jane stopped pacing and turned to face him. She could see the determination in his eyes, and it made her feel like she wasn't completely alone in this. He was in this with her, and together they would bring Michael and Lola to their knees. "I've spent too long waiting, too long building this life with Michael," she said, her voice low but filled with resolve. "I'm not going to let them take everything from me without a fight." Peter nodded. "I know. And we'll make sure they pay for what they've done. But we need to be smart about this. We can't just rush in without a plan. We need evidence. Hard, irrefutable proof that they've conspired to take control of your company and your shares." Jane's mind was already working, every bit of the puzzle clicking into place. She had always been meticulous, always strategic. Now, she would take the same skills she used to build her empire and use them to tear down the lies Michael and Lola had built. "I need access to the company's finances," Jane said, her voice cold and steady. "We need to find any loopholes, any shady deals they've made, any illegal steps they've taken to shift control. We need something that'll make this public and undeniable." Peter's face darkened slightly, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. "I can help with that. I know some people in the legal world who can help us dig deeper. We'll find something. We just need to act fast." Jane felt a surge of confidence. This wasn't just about reclaiming her shares, it was about reclaiming her dignity, her future, her power. She had sacrificed so much for this company, and she wasn't going to let Michael and Lola erase everything she had worked for. Peter continued, his voice low and deliberate. "We also need to think about the media. Once we have the evidence, we'll expose them. Michael might be a businessman, but he's still a public figure. His reputation is everything. If we go public with what we find, it'll destroy him." "I want it all out in the open," Jane said, her jaw tightening. "I want people to know exactly who Michael and Lola really are. I want them to see them for what they are, frauds. I'll take back the company. And I'll take back everything they've stolen from me." Peter nodded again, impressed by her resolve. "We'll make sure they pay for everything. They thought they could break you, Jane. But you're stronger than they ever realized." Over the next few days, Jane's mind became consumed with the plan. She couldn't afford to be emotional anymore. Every step, every action needed to be calculated. She worked closely with Peter, diving into the company's records, searching for any misstep, any illegal action Michael or Lola had taken to shift the company into their hands. They found subtle discrepancies, small enough to raise questions but big enough to use as leverage. Peter helped her connect with legal experts who knew how to maneuver through the system, how to find hidden documents, and how to exploit the weaknesses of the corporate world. Jane wasn't just going to take back her shares. She was going to make sure Michael and Lola faced the consequences of their actions. The days after Jane's decision to fight back had been a whirlwind of planning, scheming, and carefully placed moves. She was no longer the woman sitting at home, broken and betrayed. Jane had become a force, calculating, strategic, and ruthless. She had one goal now: take back her company and expose Michael and Lola for the frauds they were. As much as Jane wanted to confront them head-on, she knew that wasn't the way to win. Michael's ego and greed had always been his greatest weaknesses, and it was time for her to use those weaknesses against him. She smiled to herself as she sat at her desk, reviewing the plan she had set into motion. It was simple but effective. Jane had hired someone, a man with a reputation for making impossible deals. The kind of man who could convince anyone that the most ridiculous offer was their next big opportunity. His job was to pose as a potential investor, one who had a deal so lucrative, so appealing, that Michael wouldn't be able to resist. She had chosen her target carefully. The deal was absurd, unrealistic. It would require massive investments with 100% return on investment. But Jane knew one thing for sure: Michael's greed would blind him. The moment he saw the opportunity, he'd take it without thinking twice. He always had. And just as she had predicted, the deal came to Michael. The man, whom Jane had strategically placed in Michael's path, made his pitch. He promised returns that seemed too good to be true, and the numbers sounded like a goldmine. A deal so massive, Michael's eyes would widen, and the prospect of his name in bold letters, the success of such a deal, would cloud his judgment. Jane had carefully orchestrated every detail. She knew exactly how Michael would react to the deal. Too good to pass up. She watched as it all unfolded, the sly smile on her lips as she sat in a nearby office, listening in on the conversation between Michael and the fake investor. The man spoke with authority, tossing numbers around like they were nothing more than a harmless game. Think of it, Michael. This is the kind of deal that'll elevate your company to the top. A little risk for a huge reward. Jane could almost feel Michael's greed taking over. She could see it in the way his eyes glinted with anticipation. She knew it before he even said a word. "Sign me up," Michael replied, the words practically dripping with excitement. "This is exactly what we need. We'll make this happen. I don't need to run it by the board. We can make it work." Jane's plan was unfolding perfectly. She had known Michael would bypass the board of directors. He'd always been too eager to take shortcuts, to grab quick success without considering the consequences. And now, that very greed was going to cost him. Later that afternoon, the deal was done. Michael, without informing the board, signed the papers. The money was flowing into the company, but Jane knew it wouldn't take long before the entire thing began to unravel. The numbers didn't add up. The deal was flawed, and soon the company would start losing money. But Michael wouldn't see it coming. He was too blinded by the thought of quick profit to notice the trap closing in on him. Days later, the inevitable began.